You know, I want you to picture something with me for a second. Just imagine you make this massive life decision. You decide it is finally time to get in shape.
Right.
But you don't just do like the typical New Year's resolution thing where you go for 2 weeks and quit. You commit on a level that honestly borders on obsessive.
Yeah, full dedication.
Exactly. You go to the gym and you train consistently, relentlessly for 30 entire years, 3 decades of just absolute sweat and discipline. And the results, I mean, they're completely undeniable.
You'd be transformed.
Right. You step on the medical scales, you run the VO2 max tests, and the data is crystal clear. You are measurably, scientifically, 41% stronger, faster, and healthier than the day you first walked through those doors.
That's a massive win.
It is. You feel like a completely new person. But then, and here's the catch, the global fitness rankings get published. You eagerly scroll down the list to see your new spot rate. You're expecting this huge jump into the top tier, and you haven't moved up at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In fact, you've actually dropped 40 places.
That is brutal.
Why? Because while you were putting in all that grueling work, literally everybody else on the planet joined a gym too. So the baseline for what it means to be, quote unquote, fit entirely shifted.
It's the ultimate feeling of running incredibly fast just to stay in the exact same place on the treadmill.
Exactly.
It's a really fascinating, almost tragic psychological space to occupy. Feeling that personal triumph while simultaneously staring at a relative defeat.
Yeah, and this isn't just a metaphor about like hitting the gym or feeling bad about a marathon time. This is the exact real-world reality of an entire nation. So, welcome to our deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are looking at Zambia. Specifically, we are looking at Zambia's human development over the last 3 decades, from 1990 all the way to 2023. And if you look at the dynamic virtual environment we've set up behind you right now,
Yeah, this visualization is striking.
it really is. You can see this incredibly stark visual representation of what I'm talking about. Over on the left side of the data, there's this towering, bright green arrow pointing sharply upward, and it's labeled plus 41% human development index growth in 1990 to 2023.
Which is incredible. When you just look at that arrow, it looks like a massive victory.
Right.
It looks like an economic and social triumph of the highest order. I mean, a 41% increase in foundational human well-being. That is something most policymakers dream of achieving over a century, let alone just 3 decades.
Exactly. But then look at the right side of the screen. Right next to that triumphant green arrow, there's just this flat, stagnant, heavy gray block.
Yeah, the reality check.
And it shows Zambia's global ranking dropping from 122nd in the world in 1990 down to 162nd in 2023. And this right here is what we are calling the growth paradox.
Because the total number of countries participating in the global rankings increased over those 3 years. And the global baseline of human development moved up significantly.
Everyone else got better.
Exactly. That global tide pushed their relative position backward, despite their very real, very hard-won absolute progress.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack exactly how that happens. We are diving into a comprehensive report based entirely on the United Nations Development Program Global Database, spanning that crucial 1990 to 2023 window.
It's a goldmine of data.
It really is. We want to solve this paradox. We're going to look past the simple, flashy GDP numbers that usually dominate these conversations, and we're going to uncover 2 hidden, incredibly powerful forces dictating Zambia's reality.
Which are?
An invisible inequality tax and something called a planetary pressure ledger. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. And to really understand those forces, we have to start by fundamentally changing the way we measure a country's success.
Right, because we always just default to GDP, don't we?
Always. For a century, the absolute default ruler for human progress has been gross domestic product. How much money did a country make? What is the total value of goods and services produced?
Which is so frustrating to me. I've always hated the obsession with GDP.
It's very limiting.
Yeah, using only GDP to measure a country's success it's like trying to understand a person's overall health by only looking at their bank account.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, it tells you their purchasing power, sure. It tells you if they can afford a fancy car. But it tells you absolutely nothing about their blood pressure or their stress levels or if they are actually happy.
Right, you could have a billionaire suffering from a severe, untreated illness, deeply isolated from their family.
Exactly.
Their bank account is huge, but their human development, their actual lived experience, is failing miserably.
Yes. That is exactly it.
And that is precisely why the United Nations developed a broader dashboard. In the data we are examining today, we're going to look at 5 distinct metrics that act as diagnostic tools for a society's health.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, we start with the HDI, the Human Development Index. This is the core baseline. It doesn't just look at average wealth, but averages out 3 critical dimensions: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
Okay, so that's the baseline. What are the other 4?
From there, we apply different filters. So number 2 is the GDI, the Gender Development Index, which measures the balance of development between men and women.
Got it.
Number 3 is the GII, the Gender Inequality Index. This highlights the actual societal loss caused by those gender gaps.
Friction, basically.
Exactly. Number 4 is the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted HDI. This shows how unevenly the development is distributed across the whole population.
The rich versus poor gap.
Yes. And finally, number 5 is the PHDI. This is the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, which calculates the environmental cost of this development.
Wow. Okay, so before we put Zambia under the microscope with these 5 rulers, I think we need to understand the global neighborhood they are living in.
That's crucial context.
Right, because if their ranking dropped because everyone else was improving, what exactly did that global improvement look like?
Well, between 1990 and 2023, humanity as a whole steadily climbed. If we look at the core baseline score, the HDI, where 0 is complete deprivation and a perfect 1 represents ultimate human flourishing.
Right.
The global average went from 0.60 to roughly 0.756.
Okay, that sounds like a bunch of decimals, but what does a jump from 0.60 to 0.756 actually translate to for a human being walking around on Earth?
It translates to years added to your life and years added to your mind.
Oh, I like that.
Globally, life expectancy rose from about 65.1 years in 1990 to 73.4 years in 2023.
Wow.
Think about the gravity of that. We essentially gave the average human being on Earth 8 extra years of life.
8 more years. That's 8 more years to spend with grandchildren, to invent, to build, to just exist.
Exactly. And at the same time, the average time a person spends in a classroom increased from 5.5 years to 8.7 years globally.
That is a staggering collective achievement. But looking at the timeline on the chart here, it wasn't a perfectly smooth write-up, was it?
No, not at all. The data shows a very significant, very violent tremor recently. For the first time in decades, the global baseline experienced a distinct, sharp drop across 2020 and 2021.
The global pandemic?
Yes, COVID-19. The sheer mortality rate obviously impacted the life expectancy metric, but it was the secondary effects that caused the massive regression in human development.
Like the lockdowns.
Right. Economic lockdowns destroyed the standard of living for millions of wage workers, and the unprecedented global closure of schools severely impacted the education metrics. It was a compounding crisis.
But the chart does show it going back up, right?
It does. The data shows a global bounce back starting in 2022, resuming the historical upward trajectory.
Okay, so the global tide is rising, despite the pandemic setback. And, when you think about your own community, this data asks a really vital question.
It really does.
Does the overall economic growth of your city or your country actually reflect your personal access to quality healthcare? Like, if your local economy is booming, does it mean you have better schools or cleaner air?
Because if it doesn't, you are experiencing the disconnect that defines Zambia's story.
Exactly. So let's get into Zambia's specific 30-year roller coaster. Because when you zoom in on their line...
Yeah, when we isolate Zambia's specific trajectory, the data doesn't just show a slow, steady climb like the global average. It reveals a story of 2 radically distinct, almost contradictory eras.
2 eras. Okay.
First, a period of devastating stagnation.
Yeah.
And then followed immediately by a period of explosive, desperate growth.
The first era in the report, from 1990 to roughly the year 2000, it's basically a lost decade.
Completely.
Over 10 entire years, Zambia's baseline HDI score barely moved an inch. It shifted insignificantly from 0.422 to 0.429. For a decade, progress essentially flatlined. Why was the country frozen while the rest of the world was advancing?
The reason for that flatline becomes terrifyingly clear when we isolate the health dimension of the data.
Okay.
We see a plunge in life expectancy that is honestly hard to comprehend. In 1990, life expectancy was around 48.2 years. But by 1998, it plummeted to a devastating low of 45.7 years.
Wait, I really want to pause here because that number is incredibly difficult to process. 45.7 years.
Staggering.
We aren't talking about a life expectancy of 80 dropping to 78. We are talking about the average citizen not even making it to their 46th birthday. What mechanism could possibly cause an entire nation's life expectancy to collapse that violently in less than 10 years?
The HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Oh, wow.
It swept through the region with a ferocity that systematically dismantled the foundational structures of society. And you really have to understand the specific demographic nature of this epidemic.
What do you mean?
Well, when life expectancy drops into the mid-40s, you aren't just losing the elderly or the very young, which is typical in historical mortality spikes like famines or standard disease outbreaks.
Right.
HIV/AIDS specifically hollowed out the core working-age population.
Because of how it is transmitted, it's hitting people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s?
Exactly. You are losing the people who are in the prime of their productive lives. You are losing the trained teachers, the experienced doctors, the agricultural workers who know how to manage the harvest.
And crucially, the parents.
Yes, the parents.
That goes far beyond just a tragic loss of life. That is a structural collapse. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Losing years of life expectancy on a national scale like that is like a society being forced to hold its breath for a decade.
That's a really powerful image.
Imagine an entire generation of elders and mentors and caretakers just vanishing from your community. You lose institutional knowledge across every sector.
Absolutely.
And the ripple effect on the family unit must have been catastrophic. You suddenly have a massive spike in orphan children, and those kids don't just grieve. They have to drop out of whatever meager schooling they had to find food or raise their younger siblings.
It creates a massive demographic vacuum. The dependency ratio, which is the number of children and elderly people relying on a single working-age adult, skyrockets.
So the economy just stalls.
The economic engine of the country essentially seized up because the fuel, the human capital, was burning away. That is why the overall development score flatlined for a decade. Every economic gain was swallowed by the cost of the health crisis.
But then, the data shows this miraculous pivot, the V-shaped rebound.
Yes, the boom era.
From that incredibly dark baseline of 45.7 years in 1998, the curve of life expectancy shoots up almost vertically. By 2023, life expectancy in Zambia reached 66.3 years.
It is one of the most remarkable demographic recoveries in modern history. I mean, they gained back roughly 18 years of life expectancy from their absolute lowest point.
How does a country actually pull out of a nosedive that steep? That doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it required a monumental coordinated effort. The primary mechanism was the widespread rollout of antiretroviral therapies, or ARVs.
Right, the HIV medication.
Exactly. In the early 2000s, international funding mechanisms combined with massive domestic public health campaigns in Zambia to make these life-saving drugs accessible.
But it wasn't just dropping pills from the sky, right?
Far from it. It required building a massive logistical network of community health workers to test people, educate them, and ensure strict adherence to daily medication regimens in incredibly remote areas.
So they essentially had to build a new public health infrastructure on the fly while fighting a fire.
Precisely. And that massive recovery in life expectancy became the absolute strongest engine driving Zambia's overall 41% HDI growth.
Because health had to be stabilized before any other progress could take root.
Without surviving, you cannot thrive.
And once they could breathe again, once that survival baseline was secured, they went back to school. The data on the educational leap during this post-2000 boom is just as wild as the health recovery.
It's a huge jump.
In 1990, the mean years of schooling, so the average time an adult had spent in a classroom, was just 4.4 years. Basically a society functioning on a fourth-grade education.
Right.
By 2023, that expanded by 65%, jumping to 7.4 years.
And if we look at the predictive metric, the expected years of schooling for a young child entering the system today, it has reached 11.02 years.
That's incredible.
They have fundamentally moved from a 5-year foundational education system to an 8-year standard, with many pushing into secondary education.
What happens to a country when millions of its citizens suddenly have 3 more years of brain development, reading comprehension, and math skills?
It acts as a massive reservoir of human capital. When you have citizens living into their late 60s instead of dying in their 40s, and those citizens have 8 years of education instead of 4, you are prepping the entire nation for an economic transition.
They can take on more complex jobs.
Exactly. You suddenly have a workforce capable of shifting from subsistence farming to manufacturing, services, and technology.
So we have an 18-year gain in life expectancy and a massive 65% expansion in time spent in school. This pushes Zambia's overall development score from that stagnant flat line up to 0.595, which officially pushes them over the threshold into the United Nations Medium Human Development category.
It's a huge milestone.
Looking at this, it seems like a complete unqualified success story. People are living longer, kids are in school, the growth is real. So why the drop in the global ranking? If they are doing all this incredible work, why did they fall from 122nd to 162nd?
To answer that, we have to pull out the other diagnostic tools in our dashboard. We have to look past the average achievements and look at how that progress is actually distributed.
Okay, the filters.
Yes, we have to look at who is holding the power and who's being left behind. And that brings us to segment 3, the deep gender divides in the society.
The gender illusion. Let's look closely at this metric, the Gender Development Index, or GDI. It's designed to show the ratio of female to male development. A score of 1.0 would mean absolute perfect equality. In 2023, Zambia's score is a 0.949.
Which, if you just glance at it, looks fantastic.
Right.
It implies that women's human development has reached almost 95% of men's. It paints a picture of parity on paper. And in the basic building blocks, this is true. Life expectancy for women is high, and the expected years of schooling for young girls has caught up.
But then you turn the page in the report and look at the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. This metric doesn't look at the inputs, it looks at the societal loss caused by gender gaps. And out of all the countries measured globally on this index, Zambia ranks a dismal 141st.
It's a huge red flag.
How is that mathematically possible? How do we have a 95% equality score on one page and a 141st global ranking on the next?
The disparity between those two numbers is the difference between achieving potential and being allowed to use it in practice.
What do you mean?
The first metric measures basic capabilities. Are women alive, and are they sitting in a classroom? The second metric, the GII, measures power, autonomy, and economic reality. And when we look at labor and power asymmetry, the reality check is severe.
Hit me with the numbers.
Women are getting educated at nearly the same rate as men now, but they are systematically excluded from the levers of power. Female labor force participation sits at 56.4% compared to 67.8% for men.
Okay, that's a gap, but it doesn't seem crazy.
Wait, it gets worse. It's not just about who has a job, it's about who is making the rules. Men control 85% of parliamentary seats in Zambia.
85%.
That leaves women with roughly 15%. That is about 1 in 7 seats.
Wow. And that severe lack of political power has to translate directly into a lack of economic power.
It does. In absolute financial terms, the 2023 data shows women's gross national income per capita is $3,131, while men sit at $3,768.
That's a 20% premium just for being a man.
Exactly.
If girls are sitting in the classrooms, why aren't they sitting in the boardrooms or in parliament? It's like giving someone a ticket to a high-speed train, letting them board, giving them a comfortable seat, but permanently locking them out of the driver's cabin.
That's a brilliant analogy.
They are on the journey, they have the education, they are living longer, but they have absolutely no say in where the train actually goes, how fast it travels, or where it stops.
And the real-world consequence of being locked out of the driver's cabin is that legislation directly impacting women's survival does not get prioritized.
Because they aren't in the room to vote on it.
Right. When you only have 15% representation in Parliament,
Right.
the advancement of gender-focused policies is heavily restricted. And we see the devastating physical results of that lack of political power in the health data. We have to look at maternal mortality and adolescent birth rates.
These are the health red lines. Let's look at maternal mortality first. In 1990, the ratio was an astonishing 603 deaths per 100,000 live births.
An absolute crisis.
By 2023, that number saw a massive 77% drop, down to 135 deaths per 100,000.
Which is incredible progress.
It is a huge statistical improvement, and this is a big, but 135 is still astronomically high compared to developed nations.
Yes, it is still a heavy burden.
It means that giving birth in Zambia is still a very real, very present danger to a woman's life.
And compounding that physical risk during childbirth is the adolescent birth rate, which remains extremely high at 115.9 births per 1,000 young women.
Because what actually happens to a young woman's trajectory when she has a child as a teenager?
It derails everything.
Exactly. If you are having a child as a teenager, the odds of you finishing that newly expanded 8-year schooling system drop to 0. You are permanently sidelined into the informal economy.
Yes. The structural health burdens, specifically maternal mortality and early motherhood, prevent women from utilizing the education they are now finally receiving.
So, bringing this back to our growth paradox, this explains a huge piece of the puzzle. Zambia grew by 41%, but it's a society where half the population is structurally restricted. But the gender divide isn't the only thing dragging them down, is it?
No, we have to transition from the gender divides to the broad societal divides using our fourth ruler, the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
And this is where the numbers get really painful. Zambia's baseline score is 0.595. But when you apply the inequality adjustment, when you penalize the score to see what the average person actually experiences, that score collapses to 0.361.
That collapse represents an overall human development loss of 39.3%.
Almost 40%. We refer to this massive deduction as the inequality tax. I want to make sure the concept of this tax makes sense for you listening. Imagine you work incredibly hard at your job. You put in the overtime, you meet all your targets, and you earn a $100 paycheck.
Okay.
But before you even see it, before it even touches your hands, the system automatically deducts $39 as an inequality tax. You only get to take home $61.
That hurts.
That's what the structure of the economy is doing to the average citizen's quality of life in Zambia. The national numbers look great, but the average person is losing nearly 40% of that progress.
And the data actually allows us to break down the thieves of this progress.
Who is stealing the $39?
Income inequality is the biggest thief. It accounts for a massive 63.4% of this loss. Health inequality contributes 23.4%, and education inequality adds 20.4%.
So it's overwhelmingly about the money being hoarded at the top.
It is, but to truly understand the depth of this inequality, the report utilizes something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI.
How is that different from regular poverty? When I hear poverty, I just think of the classic living on less than $2 a day metric.
The standard income metric is deeply flawed. The MPI looks beyond just cash. And when you look at Zambia through the MPI lens, it reveals that almost half the country, 47.9% of the population, lives in multidimensional poverty.
Almost half the country. What are the specific things keeping them trapped?
The biggest culprit is the standard of living, which accounts for 53.5% of the MPI. Specific pain points include a lack of clean cooking fuel, which is 11.4% of the index, school attendance drop-offs at 16.4%, and poor nutrition at 11.5%.
I really want to focus on that lack of clean cooking fuel because to someone listening in an apartment with a gas or electric stove, that might just sound like an inconvenience, but what does it actually mean?
Lacking clean cooking fuel means families are relying on solid biomass wood or charcoal. This creates a massive time debt. It requires hours of intense physical labor every single day just to collect enough wood to boil water.
And let me guess who that labor usually falls on.
Overwhelmingly, it falls on women and young girls.
So if a young girl has to spend 4 hours a day gathering firewood, she physically cannot be in the classroom.
Exactly. This explains the paradox. Zambia grew, but because the fruits of that growth were heavily taxed by systemic inequality at the bottom, their global ranking couldn't improve against nations with more equitable distribution.
A rising tide does not lift all boats if half the boats are tied to the bottom of the ocean.
Well said. But there is a stunning plot twist in the data.
Okay, lay it on me.
We have to look at our final diagnostic tool.
Hmm?
The PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
The environmental dimension.
Yes. Globally, when you adjust human development for the ecological damage caused to achieve it, the global average HDI drops by about 10.1%.
The industrialized world takes a massive hit.
But Zambia's HDI, when adjusted for ecological damage, loses only a microscopic 1.6%.
Wow.
Zambia's per capita CO2 emissions sit at just 0.377 tons, compared to the global average of 4.54 tons.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. Isn't their incredibly low carbon footprint just an accidental byproduct of being less industrialized rather than some masterstroke of green policy?
That is the standard critique. And yes, it is tied to lower industrialization. But what's fascinating here is that intention matters less than the math.
What do you mean?
Unlike developed nations that have to spend trillions tearing down dirty infrastructure, Zambia has the ultimate clean slate. They possess enormous potential for sustainable leapfrog development.
Oh, like skipping landlines and going straight to cell phones. They can skip the coal era entirely and go straight to the clean energy era.
Exactly. It gives them a pristine ecological balance sheet.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. If we look at Zambia's human development as a corporate balance sheet, what are the assets and liabilities?
The assets.
Yeah.
A miraculous rebound in life expectancy, a massively low planetary pressure index, and a historic leap in the years citizens spend in school.
And the liabilities. A crushing 39.3% inequality tax, a severe lack of female representation in parliament, and the heavy burdens of adolescent motherhood and multidimensional poverty.
Right. So to escape the paradox by 2030, the data suggests three paths. 1. Political empowerment, aggressively boosting female parliamentary seats to at least the global average of 26.5%.
Get them in the driver's cabin.
2. Precision poverty reduction, targeting the specific MPI metrics, like universalizing electricity and clean cooking fuels.
Stop the firewood gathered.
And 3. Green leapfrogging, monetizing their low carbon footprint to attract global climate financing.
Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to mull over. For a century, we've defined progress by how fast a line on a chart goes up.
Right.
But looking at Zambia's story, perhaps the true measure of a society's advancement isn't just the sheer volume of wealth it generates, but how little of its human potential and ecological future it is willing to sacrifice along the way.
If the future of human development requires us to grow without destroying the planet, is it possible that nations currently at the bottom of the rankings are actually holding the blueprint for the future?
Something for you to think about.